Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went forth as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And from Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even though she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had every opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. This is the word of God. Now I have a confession to make. I have preached on this passage from Hebrews in about every place I've ever gone. One of all the messages that there are in the Bible, this is one of the most important for us to consider today. And I wish I could preach on it for weeks. But it is also one of the hardest passages for most Americans to hear. Now, I've been to a number of countries around the world: Italy, France, Portugal, England, Scotland, Wales, Mexico, and Canada. And I lived in England for 4 years. But of all of these, Mexico and America, and maybe a little bit of Scotland, are by far the most patriotic. But many Mexicans know all too well what it means to be a stranger and an exile. Very few white Americans know what it's like to be in a strange land as anything but a tourist. So the message that the book of Hebrews is teaching us through Genesis, it cannot sit very well with those who love their homeland. Now, England used to be much more patriotic, and they aren't anymore, as with most of Europe, which saw the horrible devastation of the First World War and the nationalism that made it only worse. It's a war that achieved very little, except to ruin the land, economy, and lives of more than a whole generation in Europe. America's involvement in the great wars of the 20th century did not involve the destruction of our own country. And so nationalism continues very strong to this day. But the English, especially in the Victorian era, were very proud to be English. And they were very proud of their world-spanning empire. William Blake, the eccentric poet and artist, wrote a poem in 1804 that has since become a sort of unofficial national anthem for England, called Jerusalem. It's a song that is sung very often today and was sung at the last royal wedding. The final stanza says, "I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land." Blake and all the English who sing this song will not cease from mental fight until the promised land and the city of God are built in England. Now, I love this song, but the message it expresses is the same troubling vision that our Puritan forebears held when they came to the shores of the New World. They were seeking to build Jerusalem in this promised land for themselves. as we will see in our story today, we as Christians are to be like Abraham, strangers and exiles, looking forward to a promised land and a city not built by human hands, but by God himself. Now last week we talked about the city and Tower of Babel and how God showed his opposition to human unity that excludes him. You'll recall that I said human unity is not the problem, but that when we exclude God from our unity, it inevitably leads to violence. Now our story today is directly linked with the city and Tower of Babel, not just because Abraham begins his journey in roughly the same area, but because the whole story of Abraham is directly opposed to the sentiment that's expressed in Babel. Many generations after that city and tower, we are transported to Ur, the Chaldees, which is in modern-day Iraq, which was then, quite unlike today, the pinnacle of human civilization. Abram, as was his name at that time, was from a place near where the city and the Tower of Babel would have been. Indeed, he would have traveled through Babylon, one of the most major cities of his day, and a city that will play a major role through the rest of our story, even making an appearance in the final book of the Bible. When the word of God comes to Abram to leave his homeland, God is calling him from a kind of New York City to go live in the middle of a land not unlike our own here in Cañon City, if it had no major cities. Instead of living in a land that was right next to the Euphrates River, a fertile farming community, God calls him to venture forth into the wilderness, into the dry wastelands that not unlike what we see around here. Abram must go from the seat of the most advanced and powerful empire in the ancient Near East to travel to somewhere he does not know. But Abram had faith. What does that mean? We talk about faith all the time in church and in religious circles. But in the Bible, it has a particular meaning. It's not a feeling that we can conjure up, convincing ourselves, as I used to try to do when I was on the swimming team, that we could walk on water if we just had enough faith, if we could just muster it up and be confident enough that we could do anything. Faith isn't like that. That's not what it means. Faith is another word for trust. Abram trusted in God's word. He trusted in God. And this is the kind of faith that the book of Hebrews commends. Faith is our trust in the faithfulness of God to keep his promises. God gave Abram a promise that he would take him to a promised land and give him innumerable descendants. Abram believed it. He knew it, even though he could not see how it would come to pass, or that it would not come to pass immediately in his life. The kind of faith that we need to have in Jesus for our salvation is not a deep feeling that singing a bunch of songs in a revival setting produces, but the enduring trust that what he said is true, in spite of all the things that we might experience in life. God takes Abram to Canaan, which is modern-day Israel, Palestine, a bit of Syria and Jordan. And there he wanders around for the rest of his life with a brief interlude in Egypt. He never settles down. Instead, he lives in tents as a nomadic shepherd. And this, again, lies in direct contrast with the sentiment of the builders of the city at Tower of Babel. Now, God was not too pleased with their good intentions of building this city and their desire for human unity. Recall that I said that in the ancient world, building a city was a very religious experience. It was their way of trying to build on earth a model of what heaven was like. Each city was a microcosm. It was the entire world in miniature. That was the sentiment of Babel. But Abraham expresses the opposite. He goes away from that and to wandering. He lives, in a sense, instead of in a world of order, of law, and a great empire, he lives in the middle of a chaotic experience, in the wilderness, where he's subject to all manner of trials that city folk do not have to experience. And then the next cities that we're introduced to in the book of Genesis are Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, we know that God destroys those quite violently. So the book of Genesis is very negative about cities. And as I've said, it's not that God is against cities in and of themselves, but against the sentiment, against the spiritual value and meaning that people put into a city. You see, a city is about settling down. It's about claiming land and owning it. It's about turning God's creation into human homelands, nations, territories, political fiefs, and countries. The psalmist says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." Having a homeland is, in this way, ultimately theft from God. Claiming that we own this or that land means that we think we have the right to dispose of it in any way we choose. And this ultimately means that we no longer have a right relationship with God, the Creator. You recall that I keep saying that the kind of relationship we have with God determines the kind of relationship we have with each other and with His creation. Now, by settling down, people demonstrate, and by owning land, they demonstrate that they're estranged from God. They want no part of it. They want to own the land, control it, and make it bend to their wills. God's creation is no longer God's to them, it's their own. And that's why we build, and that's why we create. And this is what sin is about. It's about those who are made to rule with God, expressing that rule independently and against God. But the people of God, in contrast to this, are constantly wandering. They are, as the book of Hebrews so wonderfully puts it, strangers and exiles on the earth. Because Abraham lived in a reconciled relationship with God, he could have no homeland. But he had to be a stranger and an exile. And it's a theme we'll see again and again throughout the Bible. But then what do we make of this notion of a promised land? God has promised Abraham this land to give him as an inheritance for his descendants. And what about Joshua taking possession of this land? From our New Testament perspective, we can see that the people of God never really fully take possession of this land. They make a number of mistakes along the way. They're constantly following after pagan gods. And God does not let them conquer the whole land because of this. What the writer of Hebrews makes clear is that Abraham was not looking for an actual territory. Just as we know that Abraham's descendants never really become a great nation, they always remain a small minor group used as a pawn by the various empires of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, and Rome. The history of Israel is really not all that impressive. God is not promising Abraham huge numbers of physical descendants, but millions of people who will share the same faith that he does. Faith in God's promise. Trust in who God is, and trust that God will do what He says He will do. And these people will enter into God's rest, into His promised land, into a heavenly city that is not built by human hands. But Christians seem to have forgotten this all too often throughout most of our generations. Time and again, Christians have tried to build Jerusalem in their own promised lands. And nearly every Christian nation believed that their own nation was the promised land. It's a trap that we can so easily fall into. We like to think that it is possible to turn our faith into something that will last for generations. And so we turn something living and active into a set of rules and principles and laws and institutions. But this is a trap because it means that we turn from trusting in the promises of God to building systems that make sure the promises of God will come true on our own terms. We'll be sure that our children will be faithful because we'll send them to a Christian school. It's that kind of idea. Every person needs to come to faith themselves. And so this is what you'll find out if you come to next Sunday evening's program. You'll find out that this is what Abraham is ultimately doing with Hagar and Ishmael. He tries to make God's promise come to fruition on his own terms. God promised Abraham a child, a son, but his wife Sarah cannot conceive. And so he has a child with her maidservant, Hagar. This shows his lack of faith. You see, no moral code or law or government or nation or institution can ever be Christian Only individual people can. Only individual people can trust in the promises of God and be in a reconciled relationship with God. No one can trust God for you. You have to do it for yourself. And so we as the church, as the United Presbyterian Church, we need to think long and hard about this. Now it's wonderful to look around this building at the beautiful stained glass and all of the various gifts that people have given to this church over many generations. Gifts to beautify it and build this place for future generations to cherish. But though they can leave physical gifts, their faith in God's promises cannot be transferred to us by these gifts. Only by forming relationships with younger people, telling them stories about how God has been faithful to us in spite of all of the things we've gone through. Telling our life stories and sharing them with each other. That is the only way that we can help pass on a legacy of faith to the next generation. We cannot build Jerusalem on England's green and pleasant lands, nor in America. Jesus' followers have no earthly homeland. There is nowhere that we can be fully welcomed as natives, because we have to renounce our homeland, take up our bags, and wander around the world. And we don't have to leave Cañon City physically, but we must fix our eyes on the promise of a city whose designer and builder is God himself. Now God promised that Abraham would be a blessing to all the nations. And this is the other part of the message that we find in Genesis and Hebrews. Though we are strangers and exiles, though the world is not going to find what we have to say all that appealing, what we have to say and do here is a blessing to others. For we're not here to just gaze at heaven and wish we were there now and do nothing until we die. We're here to be a blessing to each other. We have to live as pilgrims, but as pilgrims who love those in our midst along our travels, who show the world what following Jesus means by loving one another. Now this isn't a kind of institutional love, a kind of charity given through systems, corporations, and nations. It's not charity through social security. It's the personal connection that Jesus himself made with each and every one of the people who followed him and believed in him, and the kind of personal connection that Jesus has made with many of you. Abraham was called out by God to leave his homeland behind, and we're called to do the same. Not because we can just read any Old Testament story and put ourselves in their shoes. That's not how we read the Bible. It's one of the major mistakes by those who are looking to build the promised land here. We like to pick and choose Old Testament stories that appeal to us and apply to our situation, and imagine that we can do that and ignore all the others that don't seem to fit with our lives. Instead, we need to consider how this all fits into the big story that we've been talking about, and then see ourselves in light of this whole big story. Abraham is starting a family that will continue, we'll see, to Jesus Christ. And we get to join in that family, not because we are children of Abraham by blood or by descendants, by the flesh, but we become Abraham's descendants because we share in his faith. We become Abraham's descendants because we're adopted into the family of Jesus. And this makes us heirs of the same promise that he was promised by God. We are heirs to the promise of a homeland, heirs to the promise of many great descendants, and heirs to the promise of being a blessing to all the nations. We have a great city of God to look forward to, and so we live in this world as a blessing to it, but never really at home in it. We cannot build Jerusalem, but we can show each other how beautiful a place that it will be when we show each other the love that Christ has shown to us. For in the city of God, God dwells with his people, and we, living with one another here and now, are to be God's presence to one another, to love each other in that way. So go then, love your neighbors, and show them the vision of this great promised land.